my specialist subject today is life cycle assessment, but I guess before kicking off, I should really acknowledge the work that's been done by the researchers, really, which is the guys at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, neither Rosalie, who's the lead researcher, or France could be here today. So I've had to do a bit of my own research to figure out what it is all about. It's quite a tricky, I think, concept in many ways. What it's endeavouring to try and do, I think, is to address the question that Kirsty posed in her kind of welcome address, is to try and understand what on earth is happening in the round to whether it's the energy balance or the CO2 balance. Does it all make sense from a more holistic perspective? And so the team there have done some great work over the last, probably they've been active for the last 12 months or so to understand what the impact is in terms of the carbon footprint, which is the metric that we chose to look at. So I think just for completeness, we've got some contact details. So I will endeavour to answer questions during the next panel session, but if you've got any more detailed queries or those that I can't answer, Rosalie will be delighted to take them. I should also take the opportunity to mention Helen de Koninck, who was their kind of supervisor in all of this. Helen, some of you may recognise the name, was a key contributing author for many of the IPCC reports that you've seen dotted around the place. So you've got some folk with some very good bona fides, I guess. The key task really was to, in the jargon, I guess, try to assess what the carbon footprint is for 3 different scenarios. I'll come back to just what we mean by carbon footprint in a moment, but firstly the scenarios. And this really plays back or winds back all the way to what Alan was talking about in terms of the expansion options. We've got this on the left-hand side, this reference case, how to start small and build. The reference case, if you like, with one CC or carbon capture facility, essentially. And then a couple of build-out cases. So in our language, a conservative case of just over 8 million tonnes per year, and then a more optimistic one, which is around about double that. And you can see the number of facilities there as we progress. But I guess stepping back, so what do we mean by carbon footprint? I think in this case, it's trying to estimate the amount of CO2, or strictly speaking, the amount of greenhouse gas, and convert it into a CO2 equivalent number, if you like. So what's the warming potential of those different gases from a CO2 perspective? So what's the CO2 emissions content of building 1 facility, 12 facilities, 29 facilities? So in terms of the steel that's used, for instance, the coal or the gas that's used to in all of the processes in the manufacturing, in the assembly, in the transportation, installation, the operation, and finally a hot topic that Keith touched on, the decommissioning of all of that. So it's looking at it through the whole of the life cycle. And then it's going to, in some ways it's fairly simple, it's just a 3-step process. So what are the bits of kit that you need? So the pipes, the wells, the process facilities and so on. How much CO2 is created in the manufacture of that infrastructure component, and then into using it. And then finally, it was just simply calculating that over the right time period, which we'll touch on in a moment. The process, and as I've learned today, there's actually an ISO standard, so 14004 for those of you that are interested. So it's a standard methodology. Not aware that it's been applied to CCS projects in the past, but it's been applied to many other situations. Standard methodology. And so you can look at and calculate many different sorts of indicators. Our prime one has been the carbon footprint. So we're looking to just sense check that carbon capture and storage does actually make sense from a CO2 emissions perspective. And then you can look at that from a few different perspectives. And we chose to look at 3 indicators, if you like. Firstly, looking at the impact on human health and ecosystems, and then a concept around resource scarcity. And the time frame for all of those, or for those looking at those indicators and the impact simply for the calculation, as you say, just a shade over 60 years for the 2 expansion scenarios. The reference case is a little bit shorter just because it's smaller and so on. But human health, so again, it's A disability adjusted life years, daily is the acronym for that. And it tries to calculate the impact on things like respiratory diseases, cancer, malnutrition, and other kind of illness-related issues. And the ecosystems, this is the loss of species, be they freshwater, be they marine or terrestrial species. So it's the loss of those over that period. And the resource scarcity, in some ways, is for me, it feels a little bit more esoteric. So if we use something, and the basis of it is that all resources are finite. So if you use some resource now, the pool of resources is less in the future and it's more difficult. And really, the analogy, I think, is around low-hanging fruit. So when you kind of pick the apple tree or plum trees, you go for the low-hanging fruit first because it's easier, it's more accessible. As you've used all that resource, you need to get the ladder out, expend a little bit more effort, reach, get the higher fruit, carry it down further, etc. Oil and gas analogy is you start onshore US, you move to onshore Middle East, you get into the North Sea, you go deep water West Africa, and eventually you get up into the Arctic. It's always doing the easiest, cheapest things first. And so resource scarcity is the jargon, really, that the scientists in this area use to describe that increase in the cost of extraction as the resource pool itself decreases. So in the matrix, we're seeing on the left-hand side, of course, the kind of the main metric, if you like, so carbon footprint. And then those three indicators are just mentioned, and then the three cases. So I think rather than go through all of the 12 boxes, simply say that for carbon footprint, indeed, CCS is very impactful. It does reduce the amount of CO2 that's emitted, at least 50%, and for some of the bigger scenarios, you get effectively some economies of scale, and it's heading towards 70% over that time frame. The impact on health, compared to not doing CCS, is a reduction of impact on human health, so less damage to human health by the numbers you see there. Again, at the biggest scenarios, it's around about 50% reduction compared to not doing CCS. And a similar story for the impact on species lost. Of course, in order to do CCS, you're building plant, you're using predominantly gas to do or regenerate the chemicals, etc. So you're using resources. So there's a resource demand, which is why there's a notional impact on the resource scarcity of around about £20 per tonne captured, transported, and stored. So we actually did this in two steps. We did the first sweep, and then we had a look at the results and thought, that's a lot of energy. Why is all that being used? You dig into some of the assumptions, and actually some of the assumptions that are kind of standard. It's a recipe. The process is called Recipe 2016, and so you look into the assumptions about the amount of heat that is assumed required to capture 1 tonne of CO2, 4 gigajoules. And then we spoke to our colleagues at Carbon Clean Solutions of what's your process using, which is tried and tested. It's used in India, it's used throughout Europe, but it's actually 2.3, so almost half. So already the technology has evolved in terms of the efficiency, in terms of the resource impact. So it's good for the climate, and of course, using less energy, there's a huge economic benefit as well. So there's an economic imperative here that is becoming a little bit more apparent. The results that we showed earlier are with the technology that we're planning to apply on Acorn and elsewhere. And so it's really about, how can we do better, really? So, of course, it's all about using less resources. So be more efficient in the capture, or perhaps there's some more innovative ways of doing that. The biggest source of resource, I guess, was in the heat, which is predominantly gas. So you need to do that in order to regenerate the amines. The capture process that was used was one of amine solvent. In order to keep using the amine, you need to heat it, basically, and use a lot of gas for that process. Another component of the calculation assumption was that any of the heating that was provided to regenerate the amines, the CO2 resulting from that was not captured. Clearly, that's a relatively easy process improvement, I think. And the final conclusion, really, I think there is that The project, Acorn CCS, leads to major reductions in all of those indicators, obviously apart from the use of resource. So less impact on human health, less impact on ecosystems. So CCS is good. It's good to have that shown in a different perspective. For me, it's good to see it demonstrated in the round in a different way.